The October evening had settled over Grosvenor Square with that particular quality of London twilight that transforms even the most mundane gathering into something touched with mystery. I had arrived at the Meridian Gallery precisely at 7, as instructed by the elegantly embossed invitation that had appeared on my breakfast table 3 days prior. The card bore the distinctive letterhead of Sir Bartholomew Ashford, the celebrated art dealer whose eye for discovering masterpieces was matched only by his talent for orchestrating their dramatic presentation to society. Captain Hastings, Sir Bartholomew had written in his characteristic flowing script, I find myself in need of a witness to what I believe will prove to be the most significant artistic revelation of our time. Your military background and keen observation skills make you the ideal candidate for what I fear may become a rather delicate matter. The gallery's main salon buzzed with the controlled excitement peculiar to London's cultural elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm pools of light over carefully arranged clusters of guests, each group seeming to orbit around its own particular gravitational center of influence and intrigue. At the heart of it all stood an easel draped in midnight blue velvet, positioned with theatrical precision beneath a spotlight that rendered everything else in the room slightly subordinate to its mysterious presence. The gathering of suspects. Sir Bartholomew himself moved through his guests with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to managing both masterpieces and the temperaments of those who coveted them. He was a distinguished figure in his early 60s, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and the sort of penetrating blue eyes that seemed to assess the value of everything they encountered, including, I suspected, the people before him. "Hastings, my dear fellow," he greeted me warmly, though I noticed his handshake was somewhat firmer than usual, as if he were anchoring himself against some unseen current. "How good of you to come. Tonight we unveil what I believe to be the final work of Lucien Moreau, the hand that drew the final line. A piece thought lost forever, until it came into my possession through rather extraordinary circumstances." He gestured toward a striking woman in emerald silk who stood examining a smaller canvas with the intensity of a scholar. Lady Victoria Pemberton, our foremost authority on Moreau's work. Without her authentication, tonight's revelation would be impossible. Lady Victoria possessed the sort of austere beauty that suggested both intelligence and determination. Her dark hair was arranged in a severe chignon that emphasized the elegant line of her neck, and when she turned to acknowledge the introduction, her gray eyes held a quality of assessment that made me think of a jeweler examining a stone of questionable provenance. "Captain Hastings," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Sir Bartholomew speaks very highly of your discretion. I confess I find myself rather anxious about tonight's proceedings. The art world can be unforgiving when questions of authenticity arise." Near the draped easel, a younger man with prematurely silver temples was engaged in animated conversation with an elderly gentleman whose walking stick and careful posture suggested both dignity and physical frailty. Sir Bartholomew guided me toward them. "Marcus Whitfield," he said, indicating the younger man, "represents several private collectors who have expressed considerable interest in acquiring the piece. And this distinguished gentleman is Professor Edmund Hartwell, formerly of the Sorbonne, whose expertise in 19th-century French painting is without equal." Whitfield had the smooth confidence of a successful dealer, but I noticed a certain tension in his manner as he repeatedly glanced toward the veiled painting. Professor Hartwell, by contrast, seemed almost serene, though his pale blue eyes held an alertness that belied his advanced years. "A momentous evening," Professor Hartwell observed in accented English, "though I confess, Captain, that I have certain reservations about the circumstances surrounding this work's emergence. Moreau was thought to have destroyed his final paintings in a fit of despair shortly before his death." The final member of our intimate gathering was Miss Constance Reed, Sir Bartholomew's assistant and cataloguer, a woman of perhaps 30 whose unremarkable appearance concealed what I would soon learn was an encyclopedic knowledge of artistic provenance. She moved quietly through the group, making notes in a leather-bound journal and occasionally murmuring observations to Sir Bartholomew. The revelation and its consequences. As the evening progressed, the tension in the room seemed to thicken like fog rolling in from the Thames. Sir Bartholomew had promised his revelation for 8:30, and as that hour approached, I noticed subtle changes in the behavior of our small assembly. Lady Victoria's composed facade showed hairline cracks of anxiety. Marcus Whitfield's smooth patter became slightly forced. Even Professor Hartwell's scholarly detachment seemed strained. At precisely 8:30, Sir Bartholomew called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the salon, "tonight we witness the resurrection of a masterpiece. The hand that drew the final line represents not merely Lucien Moreau's last work, but his final statement on the nature of artistic truth itself." With a theatrical flourish that would have done credit to the West End, he drew away the velvet draping. The painting that was revealed drew a collective intake of breath from the assembled company. It depicted an artist's hand, rendered with extraordinary skill and detail, poised above a canvas. The hand held a brush, loaded with paint, frozen in the moment before making what would clearly be the final stroke of a masterpiece. The technique was unmistakably Moreau's, yet there was something about the work that seemed to transcend even his considerable abilities. But it was Professor Hartwell's reaction that first alerted me to the undercurrents of catastrophe flowing beneath the evening's elegant surface. The elderly scholar had gone quite pale, and I saw his hands tremble as he gripped his walking stick. "Impossible," he whispered, though his voice carried in the sudden silence. "This cannot be Moreau's work. I know every brush stroke of his final period, and this is not his hand." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathering. Lady Victoria stepped closer to the painting, her trained eye moving systematically across its surface. Marcus Whitfield's face had gone rigid with what might have been either anger or fear. "Professor," Sir Bartholomew said carefully, "surely you cannot make such a determination from a single viewing." "I can, and I do," Hartwell interrupted with surprising firmness. "This painting is a forgery. A masterful one, but a forgery nonetheless. And if I am not mistaken, it is the work of someone in this very room." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. In the electric silence that followed, I found myself studying each face in turn, noting the subtle shifts in expression that might betray guilt or innocence. It was then that I noticed Miss Reed had gone quite still, her pen frozen above her notebook, her eyes fixed on the painting with an expression I could not quite decipher. The final stroke. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Sir Bartholomew, his face flushed with indignation, stepped toward Professor Hartwell with his hand raised as if to demand satisfaction for the insult to his professional reputation. But before he could speak, his expression changed abruptly from anger to bewilderment, then to something approaching terror. I cannot," he gasped, his hand clutching at his chest. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain. "The painting, something is wrong. The hand." He collapsed before any of us could reach him, falling heavily beside the easel that held his supposed masterpiece. Miss Reed was the first to reach him, dropping to her knees beside his motionless form, but even as she felt for a pulse, I could see from her expression that Sir Bartholomew Ashford would authenticate no more paintings. As Lady Victoria summoned help and Marcus Whitfield stood frozen in apparent shock, I found myself staring at the painting that had precipitated this tragedy. The hand that drew the final line seemed to mock us with its perfection, its creator's identity, now more mysterious than ever. But it was Professor Hartwell's words that echoed in my mind as the evening dissolved into chaos and confusion. It is the work of someone in this very room. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that we would need the services of a very particular Belgian gentleman whose little grey cell specialized in untangling precisely this sort of artistic and moral complexity. The hand that had drawn the final line had indeed completed its work, but the masterpiece it had created was not a painting, but a murder most ingeniously conceived and executed. The game, as they say, was afoot. The shock of Sir Bartholomew's collapse left the gallery frozen in a tableau both macabre and surreal. The once vivid hum of cultured conversation dissolved into a hush so absolute that the tick of the ornate clock above the marble hearth sounded like a judge's gavel. Miss Reed, still kneeling by her employer's side, loosened his collar with trembling but competent hands, her face pale but composed. Lady Victoria, who had moved with such authority moments before, now stood utterly motionless, one gloved hand pressed to her lips, her eyes wide and unreadable. Marcus Whitfield seemed to shrink into himself, his confidence withering. He hovered near the edge of the group, gaze flicking between the painting and the body, as if trying to divine guilt or innocence in the interplay of brush strokes and death. Only Professor Hartwell, leaning heavily on his stick, managed to maintain some semblance of composure, though the pallor of his face and the tightness of his jaw betrayed the depth of his disturbance. The sudden arrival of 2 footmen, followed by a man of distinctly medical bearing, broke the spell. "I am Dr. Pritchard," he announced, kneeling beside Miss Reed. His examination was brisk, professional, and thorough. After a moment he straightened, lips pressed together. "I regret to say, Sir Bartholomew is gone. The cause appears to be a heart seizure, perhaps brought on by acute stress. There is a faint bitter odor, but it may be nothing. The authorities must be notified at once." At the word authorities, a subtle ripple ran through the small group. Whitfield, voice unsteady, asked, "Is it strictly necessary to—" He caught himself, flushing. "I mean, out of respect. Perhaps we could avoid a scandal, at least for the evening." Professor Hartwell's stick tapped sharply against the parquet. "Respect, Mr. Whitfield, is owed to the truth, and the truth is in this room." I did as any sensible man might. I asked for the nearest telephone. In moments, Poirot's valet Georges answered with his inimitable calm, and soon the familiar, precise voice of Hercule Poirot was on the line. "Mon ami, what catastrophe has occurred to disturb my evening tisane?" he inquired. I summarized. A painting unveiled, accusations of forgery, a sudden death. "Can you come at once, Poirot?" "I arrive, Hastings. Do not allow anything to be touched, least of all the painting." The shriek of a police siren soon shattered the night's hush. Inspector Japp, his manner brisk and unpretentious, entered with 2 constables, quickly asserting control. "Evening, Hastings. What have you gotten us into now?" He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, then directed a constable to secure the exits. Dr. Pritchard delivered his report. "Heart failure, possibly stress-induced, though there is a faint bitter scent present." Japp's eyes narrowed. "Anything out of the ordinary, we'll get the lab boys on it. Until then, no one leaves. We'll need statements from everyone." At this, the suspects shuffled into uneasy positions. Lady Victoria, always impeccable, stood with her back very straight, one hand closed tightly over something small and hard. Whitfield dabbed at his brow, casting nervous glances at the painting. Miss Reed returned to her feet, smoothing her skirt, her composure restored, but her eyes haunted. Professor Hartwell remained standing, knuckles white on his stick. We had not long to wait for Poirot. He entered as always, immaculate, mustaches waxed to perfection, grey suit unrumpled, shoes gleaming. He surveyed the scene and with a small bow greeted Lady Victoria, nodded to Miss Reed, and addressed Japp with a wry smile. "Order, I see, has fled by the window. Permit me, Inspector, to observe." "Don't touch," Japp warned automatically. Poirot smiled, raising his hands. I touch nothing. He bent over the painting, head tilted, scrutinizing both canvas and setting. With a gloved finger, he adjusted the angle of the lamp. Voila, the justice of the light. How many errors, mon cher Japp, are born of poor illumination? He questioned the group gently but incisively. Who had access to the painting before the unveiling? Miss Reed answered, Sir Bartholomew brought it from the vault this afternoon. He inspected it alone for 20 minutes, then with Lady Victoria. I arranged the drape at 7. The others saw it only when it was revealed. And the refreshments? Poirot continued, moving to a side table where 3 glasses stood. He noted, one with a finer stem. Sir Bartholomew's preference, n'est-ce pas? Miss Reed nodded. He always chose the delicate glass. Poirot examined the air above the glass, noting the faint scent. So, a man of taste. But taste can be dangerous sometimes. Japp took statements in his efficient way, asking about movements, food and drink. Poirot, meanwhile, observed everything, the chalk marks on the floor flanking the easel, the neatly coiled drape cord, Lady Victoria's clenched hand, the way Whitfield's gaze returned again and again to the painting, the tension in Miss Reed's jaw, Professor Hartwell's refusal to sit. Finally, Poirot addressed the room as a whole. There is a lie here, mes amis. Whether it ended Sir Bartholomew's life or merely set the stage, we shall discover. For now, we keep order. Disorder is the friend of guilt. Japp, never one to miss a chance, asked, You think it's murder, Poirot? Poirot's small, enigmatic smile flickered. I think the truth, like the final line of a masterpiece, is hidden by many layers. It is not always the body that gives up its secrets, but the hearts and minds of those who remain. As the constable took up his post at the door in the autumn night pressed against the gallery's windows, the painting's lifelike hand seemed to hover over us all. Threatening, promising, waiting. The investigation had begun, but the true nature of the hand that drew the final line remained shrouded in shadows, both on canvas and in the hearts of those who watched. The pale October morning light filtered through the gallery's tall windows with an almost forensic clarity, transforming the scene of last evening's cultured gathering into something resembling a laboratory where human nature itself was under examination. Poirot arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, having spent the intervening hours in what he termed the arrangement of impressions, and I found him studying not the painting itself, but the careful positioning of the chairs, the angle of the easel, and the precise coiling of the velvet drape cord. Order, mon ami, he murmured as I approached, is the first casualty of deception. When someone wishes to hide the truth, they disturb the natural arrangement of things. Observe, 3 chairs positioned for viewing, yet one shows more wear on the carpet beneath. Someone sat longer, watched more carefully, perhaps waited for an opportunity. Inspector Japp's arrival interrupted our examination, and his expression bore the particular grimness of a man whose simple case had revealed unexpected complexities. Well, Poirot, he announced, settling his notebook with evident satisfaction, your instincts were spot on. The post-mortem results came through this morning. Sir Bartholomew didn't die of natural causes. Digitalis poisoning, enough to stop a racehorse's heart. The poison's path. Poirot nodded slowly, his green eyes reflecting neither surprise nor satisfaction. Digitalis, the foxglove's gift to the murderer, a poison that mimics heart failure so perfectly that many cases go undetected. And the method of administration. That's where it gets interesting, Japp continued, consulting his notes. The poison was definitely in his wine glass. That special fine-stemmed one Miss Reed mentioned. But here's the peculiar thing. Someone washed and dried the glass before we could properly examine it. Miss Reed claims she did it automatically, force of habit after years of maintaining the gallery's pristine appearance. Most convenient for someone, Poirot observed, moving to examine the sideboard where the crystal decanter still stood, its contents undisturbed. With his handkerchief, he lifted the remaining glasses one by one, noting their positions. Yet observe, Inspector, if Mademoiselle Reed cleaned from habit, why did she leave these other glasses untouched? The habit, it seems, was most selective. Lady Victoria's Revelations. Poirot's first formal interview was with Lady Victoria Pemberton, whom he found in the small salon, surrounded by authentication documents and reference materials. She sat with the rigid composure of someone accustomed to maintaining professional authority under pressure, but I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her papers. "Madame," Poirot began with his characteristic courteous bow, "permit me to express my condolences on this most unfortunate event. Your expertise was crucial to last evening's presentation, n'est-ce pas?" Lady Victoria met his gaze directly, though her grey eyes held shadows of uncertainty. "Sir Bartholomew contacted me 3 weeks ago about the painting. He claimed it came from a private Swiss collection. The family wished anonymity, which isn't uncommon. My initial examination suggested authenticity, though I confess Professor Hartwell's outburst planted seeds of doubt." Poirot's attention focused on a small brass object resting beside her papers, the jeweler's loupe I had noticed her clutching the previous evening. "This magnifying glass, madame, it is yours?" Her composure faltered slightly. "I found it on the floor near the easel after Sir Bartholomew collapsed. Someone must have dropped it in the confusion. Yet you carry your own loupe, do you not, in your reticule, where a professional would keep such an essential tool?" Poirot's tone remained gentle, but his observation was pointed. "This suggests someone else required close examination of something very small, perhaps the signature or the title placard." Lady Victoria's hands stilled on her papers. "There's something else, Monsieur Poirot. Sir Bartholomew owed me a considerable sum for previous authentication work, nearly £3,000. His death complicates the recovery of that debt significantly. Whitfield's nervous energy." Marcus Whitfield proved even more agitated in the morning light than he had been the previous evening. Poirot found him pacing the main corridor, his usual polished confidence replaced by barely contained anxiety. The art dealer's silver-touched hair was disheveled, and his typically immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night. "This is a catastrophe," Whitfield declared without preamble. "My clients invested considerable sums based on the painting's authenticity. If it proves to be a forgery or becomes associated with murder—" He ran his hands through his hair. 20 years of reputation building, destroyed in a single evening. Poirot noted the faint dusting of gilt particles on Whitfield's shoes, the same gold leaf used in picture framing. "You have been examining frames this morning, monsieur?" Whitfield glanced down, coloring slightly. Perhaps I brushed against something in the storage room. I was looking for documentation about the painting's provenance." "And your clients?" "They remain anonymous even in a murder investigation." "Especially in a murder investigation," Whitfield replied firmly. "The art world thrives on discretion. However, I can tell you that the primary interested party was prepared to pay £2 million for the piece, assuming authentication. My commission alone would have been substantial." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Substantial enough, perhaps, to overlook certain doubts about authenticity. Professor Hartwell's academic certainty. The elderly scholar received Poirot in Sir Bartholomew's private study, where he sat surrounded by reference books and magnifying equipment. Professor Hartwell's pale blue eyes held the intensity of a man whose life's work had been challenged, and his grip on his walking stick was firm despite his advanced years. "The painting is magnificent," he admitted readily, "but it is not Moreau's work. I knew Lucien personally in his final months, watched him destroy his last paintings in despair over his failing eyesight. He told me specifically that the hand that drew the final line would remain forever in his imagination, that he lacked the physical capability to execute it. Yet here it stands before us, Professor. If not Moreau's hand, then whose? Hartwell leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. That is the most disturbing aspect of this entire affair. The technique is so perfect, so intimately knowledgeable of Moreau's methods that only someone with extraordinary access to his work and his techniques could have created it. Someone who studied him not just academically, but practically. And you conveyed these concerns to Sir Bartholomew. Repeatedly. I warned him he was risking his entire reputation, but he dismissed me as an old-fashioned pedant. He was convinced this discovery would be his ultimate vindication against what he called the stuffy traditionalists of the art world. Miss Reed's administrative access. Constance Reed appeared the most composed of the suspects, though her usual efficiency seemed strained. She received Poirot in Sir Bartholomew's office, where she had been sorting through correspondence with methodical precision. Her fair hair was perfectly arranged, but I noticed dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting little sleep. Sir Bartholomew was demanding but brilliant, she began, her voice steady. I managed all his authentication records, his correspondence with experts, his acquisition documentation. For the Moreau piece, I spent weeks verifying every detail. The Swiss collection, the family history, the chain of ownership. Everything appeared legitimate. Poirot examined the neat stacks of papers on the desk. You had access to all areas of the gallery, mademoiselle, including the vault where valuable pieces are stored? Yes, though Sir Bartholomew kept the most valuable items under his personal supervision. He was very particular about security, especially for pieces undergoing authentication. And the wine glass. You cleaned it from habit. Miss Reed's composure flickered. I've maintained this gallery's appearance for 7 years, Monsieur Poirot. Cleaning is indeed automatic, though I realize now how unfortunate the timing appears. Poirot's growing understanding. As the morning progressed, Poirot's examination of the physical evidence revealed a pattern of careful manipulation. The painting's frame was indeed new, as Lady Victoria had noted, but more significantly, the positioning of the easel showed signs of recent adjustment. Scuff marks on the floor indicated it had been moved at least twice during the previous day. Hastings, he said, drawing me aside as the interviews concluded, observe the title placard beneath the painting. The typography shows a slight misalignment. The work of someone who had access to the gallery's printing equipment but was working hastily, perhaps under pressure. I examined the small card more closely and saw what he meant. The lettering was indeed imperfect, suggesting amateur typesetting. But what does it mean? It means, mon ami, that someone in this gallery not only had the skill to create a masterful forgery, but also the access and opportunity to stage its presentation perfectly. The digitalis in Sir Bartholomew's glass was not a crime of passion, but a carefully planned elimination of the one person who might have discovered the deception too late to prevent it. Poirot straightened his tie with characteristic precision. The little grey cells, they begin to perceive the pattern. We have a forger of extraordinary skill, a murderer of considerable cunning, and a victim whose greatest weakness was his desire to believe in his own infallibility. The hand that drew the final line, Hastings, was not that of Lucien Moreau, but it may prove to have drawn the final line for Sir Bartholomew Ashford as well. As we prepared to delve deeper into the investigation, the painting stood sentinel over our efforts, its mysterious hand poised forever in the moment before creation or destruction. The game had indeed begun, and Poirot's methodical mind was already beginning to separate truth from the carefully constructed web of artistic and criminal deception that surrounded us. The pale afternoon light filtering through the gallery's tall windows seemed to mock the previous evening's elegant certainty, transforming the scene into something resembling a laboratory where human nature itself lay dissected under Inspector Japp's methodical examination. I found Poirot in Sir Bartholomew's study at precisely 2 o'clock. His green eyes reflecting neither satisfaction nor concern as he arranged his observations with characteristic precision. "The investigation progresses, mon ami," he murmured, though his tone suggested reservations about the direction of that progress. The discovery of evidence. Inspector Japp's arrival interrupted our quiet contemplation, and his expression bore the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had untangled a complex knot with admirable efficiency. "Well, Poirot," he announced, settling his notebook with evident pleasure, "I think we can put this business to bed rather neatly." He produced a small brown bottle, holding it up to catch the light. Tincture of digitalis, found in Miss Reed's desk drawer, half empty, with a chemist's label dated just last month. She claims it belonged to her elderly mother. Heart troubles, the usual story. But you know how these things look. Poirot examined the bottle without touching it, his head tilted in that characteristic manner that suggested deep consideration. "Indeed, Inspector, Mademoiselle Reed's explanation. Says her mother's been visiting the gallery these past weeks, left the medicine behind 2 nights ago. Convenient story, if you ask me, combined with her washing that wine glass and her access to every corner of this place." Japp shrugged with the confidence of a man whose case was building itself. Miss Reed's predicament. We found Miss Reed in the office, seated with the rigid composure of someone who understood the gravity of her situation. Without her usual efficient bustle, she appeared younger and more vulnerable, though her grey eyes remained steady as Japp questioned her. "The digitalis, Miss Reed. Care to explain why you kept poison in your desk?" "It is, as I stated, Inspector. My mother suffers from an irregular heartbeat. She's been staying with me while visiting London, and I kept her medication here in case of emergency. When she forgot it 2 evenings ago, I intended to return it after the unveiling." Poirot stepped forward with his characteristic courteous bow. "Mademoiselle, when you prepared Sir Bartholomew's special glass yesterday evening, did you position it in any particular way?" Her composure flickered slightly. "Yes. There's a tiny chip on the rim, almost invisible. Sir Bartholomew disliked it touching his lip, so I always positioned it to the left, away from where he would drink." "And you prepared this glass at what time?" 8 o'clock, just before the announcement. He drank from it immediately before unveiling the painting." Japp closed his notebook with satisfaction. "That settles it, then. Opportunity, means, and she destroyed the evidence by cleaning the glass. We'll have her in custody within the hour." Poirot's dissent. When Japp had departed to arrange the arrest, Poirot remained motionless for a long moment, his moustaches twitching with what I recognized as profound dissatisfaction. "Hastings," he said finally, "what troubles you about this solution?" I considered carefully. "It seems almost too convenient, doesn't it? Everything falls into place rather neatly." "Précisément. Consider, Mademoiselle Reed is a woman of extraordinary precision. She positions a glass to avoid a tiny chip. She maintains immaculate records. She notices every detail of gallery operations. Such a mind, if it committed murder, would not wash a single glass while leaving others untouched, then sit calmly beside the victim awaiting discovery. No, mon ami, if she killed, she would clean everything or nothing. There is a discord here that offends the little grey cells." The Swiss deception unraveled. Our investigation that afternoon revealed layers of deception far more complex than Japp's straightforward solution suggested. Miss Reed's documentation of the Swiss collection proved both extensive and troubling. Letters from Zimmermann, Kessler and Associates in Geneva, telephone records, even photographs of the painting in what appeared to be a private residence. The initial contact seemed entirely legitimate, Miss Reed explained, her professional pride overriding her personal predicament. I verified the law firm's registration, spoke by telephone with Herr Zimmermann himself. His knowledge of art market procedures was impeccable. Yet Japp's inquiries had revealed the stark truth. No such firm existed in Geneva, and no Swiss family had disposed of Moreau works in recent years. Someone had constructed an elaborate fiction, complete with false documentation and a convincing telephone persona. The level of preparation required, Miss Reed continued, her voice barely above a whisper, suggests someone with considerable resources and international connections. This was not the work of a desperate assistant protecting her position. Whitfield's desperation. Marcus Whitfield's afternoon confession added another dimension to our understanding of the crime's complexity. I found him in the storage room, examining frames with the intensity of a drowning man searching for salvation, his usual polished confidence replaced by barely contained panic. "I've been living a lie, Monsieur Poirot," he admitted without preamble. "The commission from this sale, I'd already spent most of it. My business has been failing for 2 years. I borrowed heavily against the expected proceeds, convinced my creditors the Moreau deal was certain." His financial desperation was complete. The painting's exposure as a forgery, combined with Sir Bartholomew's death, had eliminated his last hope of avoiding bankruptcy. But more disturbing was his revelation about his mysterious client. "The buyer I represented. He's withdrawn his interest completely. £2 million vanished overnight, and he's not the sort of man who accepts disappointment gracefully." Lady Victoria's technical analysis. Lady Victoria's examination of the painting using portable X-ray equipment borrowed from the British Museum revealed the most intriguing contradiction yet. Her findings challenged every assumption about the work's creation. "The canvas is period-appropriate," she reported, her professional manner intact despite the morning's revelations. "The primers and ground layers match Moreau's known techniques perfectly. Most significantly, there are pentimenti, changes made during the painting process, visible under X-ray analysis. These pentimenti," she explained, "were alterations made by the artist during creation, rather than copying. The hand had originally been positioned lower, the brush held at a different angle. Such changes indicated original creative thought rather than mere forgery. Yet here lies the mystery," she continued, her confidence wavering. "The brushwork shows 2 distinct pressure patterns, as if someone was guiding or being guided during the painting's creation. The physical evidence." Poirot's examination of the gallery's physical evidence revealed a pattern of careful manipulation that supported his growing theory of elaborate conspiracy. The gold leaf particles on Whitfield's shoes matched similar traces found near the painting's easel, despite his claims of only examining documentation. The brass loop Lady Victoria had discovered bore faint initials, M.W., scratched into its inner rim, suggesting Whitfield had used it for close examination of something requiring magnification. Most significantly, Poirot's investigation of the storage vault revealed clear evidence of recent activity. Indentations in the stone floor marked where heavy objects had been moved and replaced, and fresh oil stains suggested someone had opened and adjusted stored artworks multiple times in recent days. "The choreography of nerves, Hastings," Poirot observed, examining a faint smear of varnish on the vault wall. "Someone has been very busy in preparation for last evening's performance." Poirot's synthesis. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot gathered his observations in Sir Bartholomew's study, his notebook filled with precise sketches and timelines. His methodical analysis was revealing a conspiracy far more sophisticated than Japp's simple solution suggested. "Observe, mon ami, how each suspect presents both compelling guilt and reasonable innocence. Miss Reed possessed access and opportunity, yet her documentation suggests she too was deceived by the Swiss fiction. Professor Hartwell had knowledge to expose or create the fraud, but his academic reputation would suffer equally from either. Lady Victoria commanded the technical skills for authentication or forgery, yet her professional standing depends entirely on her integrity, and Monsieur Whitfield faced financial ruin, but was he victim or architect of this elaborate deception. The pattern, emerging from Poirot's investigation, suggested not a single desperate murderer, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving multiple participants, each playing their assigned role in a masterpiece of criminal artistry. The hand that drew the final line, Hastings, was not working alone, and the poison that ended Sir Bartholomew's life was merely the final brushstroke in a composition that has been years in the making. As evening approached and the gallery settled into shadow, the painting continued to dominate our investigation with its mysterious perfection. But Poirot's methodical dismantling of appearances was beginning to reveal the human flaws hidden beneath its artistic brilliance. Flaws that had led inevitably to murder and would soon lead just as inevitably to justice. The false solution that satisfied Inspector Japp was merely another layer of deception, as carefully constructed as the painting itself. But unlike the forger's masterpiece, this deception would not survive Poirot's relentless pursuit of truth. The pale morning light filtering through the gallery's windows seemed to mock Inspector Japp's confident stride as he returned with news that would fundamentally alter our understanding of the case. I found Poirot in Sir Bartholomew's study, methodically arranging his observations with that characteristic precision that suggested his little grey cells were approaching a significant revelation. "Well, Poirot," Japp announced, though his earlier certainty had clearly suffered considerable damage. "We've had to release Miss Reed. Her story checks out completely. Mother's medical records, prescription dates, even the chemist's verification. The digitalis bottle was full, not half empty as I initially thought, and the fingerprints belong exclusively to the Reed women." Poirot's satisfaction was evident, though carefully controlled. "And the wineglass, Inspector?" "Clean, naturally, since it was washed. But we found traces of digitalis in the dregs of the decanter itself, concentrated at the bottom as if someone calculated precisely when Sir Bartholomew would pour his evening glass. The unravelling of simple solutions. With Miss Reed's innocence established, Poirot turned his attention to the remaining suspects with renewed intensity. His approach combined the methodical questioning that had made him legendary with a subtle psychological pressure designed to reveal the deeper truths hidden beneath their carefully constructed facades. He began with Professor Hartwell, whom he found in the library with an expression that suggested both resignation and relief. The elderly scholar's earlier frailties seemed to have given way to a strange kind of peace, as if the burden of deception had finally become too heavy to bear. "Monsieur Poirot," Hartwell said without preamble, "I believe the time has come for complete honesty. The painting, the hand that drew the final line, I created it myself." The confession settled into the room like dust after an explosion. Poirot's expression remained carefully neutral, though I noticed his fingers had assumed that characteristic steeple that indicated intense concentration. "Continue, Professor." 30 years ago, I was Lucien Moreau's student, then his closest friend. In his final months, when cataracts were stealing his vision, he would describe paintings he could no longer execute. This particular work obsessed him, a meditation on artistic creation itself, the moment of ultimate decision. He made me promise never to attempt it while he lived. Hartwell's voice grew stronger as he continued. "After his death, the vision haunted me. I spent decades perfecting his techniques, studying every authenticated brushstroke. 5 years ago, facing my own mortality and mounting medical expenses, I finally completed what he had envisioned. It was meant as tribute, never intended for sale." The Swiss deception revealed. The elaborate fiction that had deceived even Miss Reed's meticulous verification process proved to be a masterpiece of collaborative deception. Working with Henri Dubois, a former student now practicing law in Geneva, Professor Hartwell had created the fictional firm of Zimmermann, Kessler and Associates, complete with telephone service, professional correspondence, and convincing documentation. The provenance was perfect because it was created by professionals with intimate knowledge of authentication procedures, Hartwell explained. But Sir Bartholomew's enthusiasm attracted attention far beyond what I had anticipated. The sale price escalated, serious collectors became involved, and the deception grew beyond my control. Most significantly, Sir Bartholomew had begun to harbor private doubts despite his public confidence. He spoke of arranging an independent assessment, Hartwell revealed, by Dr. Klaus Richter, the German expert whose integrity is legendary. Richter was scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning for a comprehensive examination. The broader conspiracy. Poirot's subsequent interviews revealed a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication, with each participant playing a carefully orchestrated role. Lady Victoria's authentication had been technically accurate, while remaining deliberately ambiguous. She had recognized Professor Hartwell's hand in the brushwork, but had provided conclusions that allowed Sir Bartholomew to reach his desired interpretation. My reputation depended on this discovery, she admitted, her professional composure finally cracking. I told myself I was protecting Professor Hartwell while allowing Sir Bartholomew his moment of triumph. The pentimenti I observed were too perfect, too knowing. Clearly the work of someone with intimate understanding of Moreau's creative process. Marcus Whitfield's involvement proved even more complex. His mysterious client, he revealed, was not a legitimate collector, but someone whose wealth came from considerably less legal sources. A man who collected forgeries specifically, masterpieces that could never be publicly displayed or officially owned. He advanced me substantial sums against the purchase, Whitfield confessed, his usual polish completely gone. When Professor Hartwell's illness accelerated the timeline and Sir Bartholomew's investigation threatened exposure, I was trapped between my debts and my client's expectations. Poirot's psychological gambit. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot orchestrated what he termed a small demonstration of human nature under pressure. He assembled the three primary suspects in the main gallery, where the disputed painting still held its place of honor beneath carefully arranged lighting. "Mes amis," he began, his voice carrying that particular authority that commanded absolute attention, "we have established that this magnificent work is indeed the creation of Professor Hartwell, painted as tribute to his beloved mentor. We have also established that Sir Bartholomew died not from natural causes, but from digitalist poisoning administered with surgical precision." He moved closer to the painting, his green eyes reflecting an almost predatory satisfaction. "But what we have not yet established is which among you decided that murder was preferable to exposure." The psychological pressure in the room was almost tangible. Lady Victoria stood with rigid composure, though her hands trembled slightly. Whitfield appeared to shrink into himself, his earlier desperation now completely visible. Professor Hartwell remained seated, gripping his walking stick with white knuckles. "The murderer," Poirot continued, "possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Bartholomew's habits, access to the gallery during preparation, and the cold calculation to ensure no innocent person would be harmed. This was not desperation, but careful planning." He paused dramatically before the painting. "And now I shall demonstrate how the guilty party will reveal themselves through their own actions." The moment of truth. What followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation worthy of Christie's greatest scenes. Poirot announced his intention to examine a crucial detail hidden behind the painting's title placard, a detail that only the true creator would recognize. "The mark I speak of," he said with calculated ambiguity, "will identify definitively whether this work is genuine Moreau or masterful tribute. Once revealed, there can be no further deception." The effect was immediate and revealing. Professor Hartwell's scholarly composure cracked slightly, but with what appeared to be relief rather than fear. Lady Victoria's professional mask showed hairline fractures of anxiety, but her concern seemed focused on reputation rather than criminal exposure. It was Marcus Whitfield whose reaction proved most telling, a barely suppressed panic that suggested stakes far higher than mere financial embarrassment. "The examination will take place tomorrow morning," Poirot announced, in the presence of Dr. Richter, whose arrival Sir Bartholomew had arranged. "Justice, mes amis, like great art, requires proper illumination." The final brush stroke. As evening approached and the suspects departed under Japp's watchful supervision, Poirot remained before the painting, his expression thoughtful and slightly melancholy. "The hand that drew the final line," he murmured, "was indeed motivated by love, Professor Hartwell's tribute to his mentor's vision. But the hand that drew the final line of Sir Bartholomew's life, that hand was motivated by something far more base." The painting continued to preside over our investigation, its mysterious hand forever poised in the moment before creation. But unlike its artistic perfection, the human conspiracy it had inspired was beginning to reveal the fatal flaws that would lead inevitably to justice. "Tomorrow, Hastings," Poirot said with quiet satisfaction, "we shall see which of our suspects values their freedom more than their reputation. The psychological trap is set, and the guilty party will spring it themselves through their own desperate actions." The game had reached its crucial phase, and I could sense that Poirot's methodical dismantling of appearances was approaching its climactic revelation. The hand that had drawn the final line would soon be exposed, along with the murderer whose masterpiece was not art, but death itself. The grey October dawn settled over Grosvenor Square with the particular quality of London morning light that transforms even the most elegant settings into stages for revelation. I found Poirot positioned before the disputed painting at precisely 8 o'clock, his green eyes reflecting a satisfaction that suggested the night's contemplation had yielded the final pieces of his complex puzzle. "Hastings," he greeted me with characteristic precision. "Observe how morning light reveals what evening shadows concealed. Today, we separate the masterpiece from the murder, the art from the artifice." The arrival of Dr. Richter. Dr. Klaus Richter's arrival at 10:30 brought with it an air of uncompromising scientific authority. Tall and austere, with steel-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, he commanded the sort of respect that made even our assembled suspects straighten unconsciously in acknowledgement of his legendary reputation for exposing artistic deceptions. "Gentlemen," Dr. Richter announced in precisely accented English, "Sir Bartholomew contacted me with specific concerns about technical anomalies he had observed. His instincts, it appears, were unfortunately correct. His examination equipment was formidable: portable X-ray apparatus, spectrographic analyzers, and magnification devices that could reveal the most minute details of artistic construction. As he arranged his instruments with methodical precision, I observed the subtle but telling reactions of our suspects. Professor Hartwell sat with resigned dignity, his confession of authorship having lifted a burden from his scholarly conscience. Lady Victoria maintained her professional composure, though her hands betrayed nervous tension as she repeatedly adjusted her gloves. Marcus Whitfield, however, appeared barely able to contain his agitation, his usual polished confidence replaced by barely suppressed panic as he repeatedly glanced toward the gallery's exits. The scientific revelation. Dr. Richter's analysis proceeded with Germanic thoroughness that left no detail unexamined. His findings, delivered in the dispassionate tone of absolute expertise, began systematically dismantling the carefully constructed deceptions surrounding the painting's presentation. "The canvas is indeed period-appropriate," he announced, adjusting his spectroscopes, "but the stretcher frame shows modern construction techniques. More significantly, spectroscopic analysis reveals synthetic pigment compounds unavailable during Moreau's lifetime, though skillfully combined to match his documented palette precisely." Professor Hartwell nodded with something approaching relief. "I used modern materials to ensure the work's longevity, though I attempted to match Moreau's visual techniques exactly. It was never intended to deceive. merely to preserve his vision. But Dr. Richter's most significant discovery emerged from his examination of the title placard beneath the painting. "This identification card has been altered recently," he declared, his magnifying glass revealing microscopic details invisible to casual observation. "The original text has been carefully removed and replaced. The typography shows slight irregularities consistent with amateur typesetting equipment." Poirot's psychological gambit. The moment Dr. Richter announced his intention to reveal what lay beneath the altered placard, the psychological pressure in the room became almost tangible. Poirot, positioned with theatrical precision where he could observe every face, watched as his carefully laid trap began to close. "The examination will reveal the painting's original title," Poirot announced with calculated emphasis, "and perhaps explain why someone found it necessary to conceal Professor Hartwell's true intentions." Marcus Whitfield's reaction was immediate and devastating. His face went ashen, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning's coolness, and his hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket before stopping, as if burned by the gesture's implications. "Surely such detailed examination is unnecessary," Whitfield said quickly, his voice strained beyond recognition. "Professor Hartwell has admitted to creating the work. The question of authenticity is settled." Poirot's eyes glittered with predatory satisfaction. "But Monsieur Whitfield, complete understanding of the deception is essential for justice, unless perhaps you fear what Dr. Richter's examination might reveal about your own involvement in this affair." The trap springs. What followed unfolded with the terrible inevitability that characterizes the finest Christie revelations. As Dr. Richter prepared his instruments to examine the concealed text, Whitfield's carefully maintained facade finally shattered completely. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as his hand emerged from his jacket, clutching a small glass vial. "This goes far beyond a simple forgery." Inspector Japp moved with surprising speed, but Whitfield was already backing toward the gallery's entrance, the vial held threateningly before him. The clear liquid within was odorless, but Poirot's sharp intake of breath suggested he recognized its lethal potential immediately. "Digitalis concentrate," Poirot observed with deadly calm. "The same preparation used to murder Sir Bartholomew, I suspect. Enough to eliminate everyone who threatens your carefully constructed deception." The full confession. Cornered and facing inevitable exposure, Whitfield's remaining composure crumbled entirely. The confession that poured from him revealed a criminal conspiracy far more sophisticated than any of us had imagined. Sir Bartholomew was going to destroy everything. Whitfield's voice carried the hollow ring of complete defeat. His investigation would have exposed not just the painting's origins, but the entire network I've spent years constructing. My client doesn't accept failure gracefully. The criminal enterprise Whitfield described involved multiple forgers, corrupt appraisers, and collectors whose wealth came from sources that could not bear scrutiny. Professor Hartwell's masterpiece, created from love and devotion to his mentor, had been perverted into the centerpiece of an elaborate scheme to supply wealthy criminals with artistic treasures that could never be publicly displayed or officially owned. "The Swiss collection was my creation," Whitfield admitted, his usual polish completely gone. "Professor Hartwell's tribute to Moreau was perfect for my purposes, a masterpiece that could satisfy the most sophisticated collector while remaining forever hidden from legitimate scrutiny." Poirot's masterstroke. Rather than attempting physical confrontation, Poirot began dismantling Whitfield's remaining defenses through pure intellectual force. His approach was masterful in its psychological precision. "Consider, Monsieur Whitfield," Poirot said conversationally, as if discussing art rather than facing a desperate murderer. "Your client's reaction when he discovers the painting is now evidence in a murder investigation. Such men view failure not as disappointment, but as betrayal requiring permanent correction." The words struck Whitfield like physical blows. His face went even paler as the full implications of his situation became clear. The criminal network he had served so faithfully would now view him not as a valuable asset, but as a catastrophic liability requiring elimination. "You have perhaps minutes before news of this morning's events reaches interested parties," Poirot continued relentlessly. "Your choice is not between freedom and imprisonment, but between justice and something far more final." The final revelation. The psychological pressure proved decisive. Whitfield's hand slowly lowered, the vial falling to shatter harmlessly against the gallery's polished floor. As Japp's constables moved to restrain him, his final words carried the weight of complete moral collapse. "Sir Bartholomew suspected everything," he whispered. "He saw me in the vault the night before the unveiling, adjusting the display. When he announced Dr. Richter's examination, I knew he wasn't just authenticating the painting. He was investigating me. The digitalis in his special glass was calculated to the exact moment he would drink after his triumph." Dr. Richter, with characteristic thoroughness, completed his examination of the altered placard. Beneath Whitfield's careful forgery lay the painting's original title, Hommage à mon mère, Professor Hartwell's simple tribute to Lucien Moreau. Justice and reflection. As Marcus Whitfield was led away in handcuffs, the gallery seemed to exhale collectively, releasing tension held too long. Professor Hartwell remained seated with dignity intact, his scholarly integrity having survived the ordeal. Lady Victoria stood with professional composure restored, though her experience would forever influence her approach to authentication. Poirot stood before the painting one final time, his expression thoughtful and touched with melancholy. The hand that drew the final line was indeed motivated by love, Professor Hartwell's tribute to his mentor's vision. But the hand that drew the final line of Sir Bartholomew's life was guided by greed, fear, and the terrible arithmetic of criminal enterprise. The investigation had concluded with justice served, but the painting continued to preside over the gallery with its mysterious perfection. Unlike the human conspiracy it had inspired, Professor Hartwell's masterpiece would endure as testimony to the power of artistic devotion and a reminder of the dangers that arise when such devotion becomes entangled in webs of deception and murder. As we prepared to leave the gallery, Poirot paused at the threshold, his green eyes reflecting satisfaction tempered by sadness. "Art reveals truth through beauty, mon ami. But sometimes the truth it reveals is far uglier than the beauty that conceals it. The hand that drew the final line has been exposed, and justice, like great art, requires proper illumination to achieve its full effect." The psychological trap had worked to perfection, forcing the guilty party to reveal themselves through their own desperate actions. The masterpiece of murder had been solved through the greater masterpiece of Poirot's methodical mind, proving once again that no deception, however sophisticated, can long survive the relentless pursuit of truth guided by the little grey cells. The pale morning light filtering through the gallery's tall windows carried with it an unsettling quality that seemed to mock the previous evening's apparent resolution. I found Poirot in Sir Bartholomew's study at precisely 8 o'clock, his green eyes reflecting not the satisfaction of a case concluded, but the particular alertness that suggested his little grey cells had detected some discord in what others considered harmony. "Hastings," he greeted me with characteristic precision, though his tone carried undertones that made me immediately wary. "Observe how morning light reveals what evening shadows concealed. The arrest of Monsieur Whitfield has resolved one mystery, but I fear it has illuminated another. The aftermath of justice. Inspector Japp's arrival at 8:30 brought with it the methodical satisfaction of a man whose case files were finally achieving proper order. Whitfield's confession during the night had revealed layers of criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond a single art forgery. encompassing a network of corrupt dealers, compromised experts, and collectors whose wealth came from sources that could never bear legitimate scrutiny. "He's given us names, addresses, the whole bloody network," Japp reported with evident pleasure. "Turns out this Swiss collection fiction was just one of dozens they've been running. Art forgeries, stolen pieces with false provenance, even legitimate works sold to buyers who couldn't afford public ownership. Whitfield was small fish in a very large and very dirty pond." Yet Poirot's expression remained troubled, his moustaches twitching with a particular agitation that indicated unresolved elements. "And the digitalis, Inspector, the precise calculation required for Sir Bartholomew's murder. Prepared 3 days in advance from his mother-in-law's heart medication. Bitter irony, considering we initially suspected Miss Reed for the same reason. He'd been studying Sir Bartholomew's habits for weeks, timing everything to coincide with the unveiling's excitement, made the heart failure appear completely natural. Professor Hartwell's vindication. The elderly scholar's position had transformed overnight from suspected criminal to unwitting victim of elaborate exploitation. His confession of creating the painting, delivered with such dignity, now appeared in its proper light, not as admission of fraud, but as testament to artistic integrity that had been perverted by others for criminal purposes. "I spent 2 years on Hommage à mon maître," he explained to Poirot with quiet pride, his earlier distress replaced by something approaching peace. Every brush stroke was a meditation on Lucien's techniques, every color choice a memory of conversations we shared in his final months. When my medical expenses mounted and my pension proved inadequate, I approached several dealers discreetly, making clear the work's true nature and my intentions. Whitfield had discovered the painting through these legitimate inquiries, but had immediately recognized its potential for his criminal network. The elaborate Swiss provenance, the fictional legal firm, even the careful alteration of the title placard from Hommage à mon maître to the hand that drew the final line, all had been designed to transform Professor Hartwell's honest tribute into a weapon of deception. The deeper implications. Dr. Richter's continued examination of the physical evidence revealed troubling inconsistencies that had been overshadowed by the drama of Whitfield's arrest. His methodical analysis, conducted with Germanic thoroughness, was uncovering details that suggested the conspiracy's reach extended even further than Whitfield's confession had indicated. The alteration of the title placard was performed with professional equipment, Dr. Richter reported, adjusting his magnification apparatus. The typography shows precision that exceeds amateur capabilities. More significantly, there are microscopic traces of specialized adhesives used primarily in museum conservation work. This revelation cast new shadows over the case's apparent resolution. The level of technical expertise required suggested involvement by someone with access to professional conservation equipment and materials, resources not typically available to art dealers like Whitfield, however corrupt their practices might be. Poirot's growing concern. As the morning progressed, Poirot's examination of the gallery's security arrangements revealed patterns that troubled his methodical mind. The timing of various access points, the positioning of surveillance equipment, even the scheduling of cleaning staff, all showed signs of careful study and manipulation that extended far beyond Whitfield's admitted activities. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, examining faint marks on the floor near the painting's easel. "How the evidence suggests not merely criminal opportunism, but systematic preparation extending over months, perhaps years. The murder of Sir Bartholomew was not desperate improvisation, but the culmination of a long-term strategy." His investigation of the vault's security systems revealed particularly disturbing evidence. Access logs showed multiple entries during periods when the gallery was officially closed, entries that corresponded to no legitimate maintenance or security activities. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of alarm systems had been visiting the gallery's most secure areas with impunity. The remaining questions. Lady Victoria's authentication documents, subjected to more detailed scrutiny, revealed subtle inconsistencies that suggested her involvement in the deception ran deeper than mere professional compromise. Her technical analysis had been accurate in its assessment of Professor Hartwell's skill, but her conclusions had been carefully crafted to support predetermined outcomes rather than objective evaluation. The spectroscopic data I provided was genuine, she admitted under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning. But my interpretation emphasized elements that supported Sir Bartholomew's desired conclusions, while minimizing those that suggested contemporary creation. I told myself I was protecting Professor Hartwell from scandal, while allowing Sir Bartholomew his moment of triumph. Miss Reed's meticulous documentation of the Swiss collection's provenance revealed similar patterns of manipulation. Her research had been thorough and professional, but the sources she had verified proved to be elaborate constructions designed to withstand exactly the sort of investigation she would conduct. The Unfinished Symphony. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the gallery's polished floors, Poirot assembled his observations with characteristic precision. The arrest of Whitfield had solved the immediate question of Sir Bartholomew's murder, but had revealed a conspiracy of such sophistication that its full extent remained unclear. The hand that drew the final line of Sir Bartholomew's life has been identified and arrested, he observed, his voice carrying the particular gravity reserved for incomplete conclusions. But the hands that guided that final stroke, that orchestrated the circumstances, making murder necessary, remain hidden in shadows that even morning light has not yet penetrated. The painting itself continued to preside over our investigation with serene indifference to the human dramas it had inspired. Professor Hartwell's masterful tribute to his mentor had become the centerpiece of a criminal enterprise whose tentacles reached far beyond a single corrupt dealer's ambitions. The promise of further revelation. As we prepared to continue our investigation, Poirot paused before the disputed masterpiece one final time, his expression thoughtful and touched with the particular intensity that preceded his most significant revelations. "Tomorrow, Hastings, we shall discover whether justice has been fully served, or whether we have merely arrested the instrument while the true composer of this criminal symphony remains at liberty. The little grey cells suggest that the hand which drew the final line was guided by intelligence far more sophisticated than Monsieur Whitfield's desperate opportunism. The investigation had reached a crucial juncture where apparent resolution revealed deeper complexities. The masterpiece of murder had been partially solved, but the full scope of the conspiracy remained hidden beneath layers of deception that would require all of Poirot's methodical brilliance to penetrate. As evening approached, the painting's mysterious hand seemed to mock our efforts with its eternal moment of creation, a reminder that some final lines remain forever undrawn, waiting for the perfect moment to complete their deadly artistry. The game, as they say, was far from over. The crisp October morning settled over the gallery with an almost crystalline clarity that seemed to strip away the last veils of deception surrounding our investigation. I found Poirot in the main salon at precisely 9 o'clock, positioned before Professor Hartwell's masterpiece with an expression that suggested his little grey cells had finally detected the crucial discord that had troubled him since Whitfield's arrest. "Hastings," he greeted me with that particular tone of quiet intensity that indicated approaching revelation, "observe how morning light reveals what evening shadows concealed. The arrest of Monsieur Whitfield has resolved one mystery, but I fear it has illuminated another, far more insidious. The hidden evidence emerges." Dr. Richter's overnight analysis had yielded the crucial evidence that Poirot's instincts had suggested must exist. His Germanic thoroughness had uncovered not merely the sophisticated materials used in the title placard's alteration, but something far more telling, a microscopic synthetic fiber, barely visible even under magnification, caught in the placard's edge. This filament, Dr. Richter reported with scientific precision, is not cotton, wool, or silk. It appears to be a specialized polymer used exclusively in high-end optical cleaning cloths, the type employed in museum conservation work for delicate instruments and surfaces. The implications struck me immediately, but Poirot's knowing glance suggested he had been building toward this revelation methodically. His examination of Lady Victoria during our previous interviews had noted subtle details: the perfect clarity of her spectacles, the immaculate condition of her conservation tools, the way she handled delicate materials with practiced expertise. More significantly, Dr. Richter continued, my analysis of the painting itself reveals what Lady Victoria described as dual pressure patterns in the brushwork. These are not merely pentimenti, changes during creation, but evidence of guidance. Someone with intimate knowledge of Moreau's actual techniques assisted in the painting's execution. Poirot's psychological gambit. Inspector Japp's arrival brought news that would prove crucial to Poirot's developing strategy. Whitfield's confession, while comprehensive regarding his criminal network, contained significant gaps about the technical expertise required for the conspiracy's success. The Swiss operation was more sophisticated than we initially understood, Japp reported. The telephone numbers traced to a legitimate law firm in Geneva, one that specializes in art authentication. Someone created a perfect parallel operation, complete with professional staff who believed they were handling legitimate transactions. Poirot nodded slowly, his mustaches twitching with suppressed excitement. Précisément, Inspector. And such sophistication requires not merely criminal cunning, but institutional authority. Someone whose position provides unquestioned access to the highest levels of art world infrastructure. It was then that Poirot announced his intention to conduct what he termed a final examination of the painting's mounting. His announcement was delivered with grave ceremony calculated to reach the ears of all remaining suspects. Tomorrow morning, he declared, Dr. Richter and I shall demonstrate a detail no one has yet considered. It lies beneath the inner rebate of the frame, minute but decisive. The original mounting preserves something the framer did not notice, contact traces that are as personal as fingerprints. When revealed, they will identify the hands that prepared this canvas for its deceptive presentation. I observed the reactions carefully. Professor Hartwell's shoulders relaxed slightly. His involvement was honest and already confessed. Miss Reed appeared genuinely curious, making notes with professional interest. But Lady Victoria's response was subtly different, a barely perceptible stiffening, a slight movement at her throat as if swallowing had become difficult. The trap springs. Poirot's arrangements for the evening were characteristically thorough. He requested that the obvious constable on duty be relieved at midnight and replaced with one who is fond of dozing most credibly, while a plainclothes officer would be stationed in the sculpture gallery behind a screen. The painting itself would remain in place, though the gallery's lighting suggested it had been moved to the strong room for security. We returned after dinner with the stealth of investigators rather than guests. The gallery, after hours, possessed that peculiar silence that seems to listen, its polished floors reflecting wan ovals of streetlight through the curtains. Poirot installed me behind a Japanese screen while he settled into the shadows by the fireplace. Dr. Richter, insisting on remaining, sat upright with admirable patience. The first sound came at 20 minutes past 1, the faintest metallic contact as someone disabled the alarm system with professional precision. A thin blade of light traced beneath the door, then dimmed as the intruder entered with confident, practiced movements. The scent that reached us in a momentary draught was unmistakable. Clove oil mixed with conservation chemicals, the telltale perfume of a museum, professional's toolkit. I held my breath as the figure worked by shaded torchlight, opening a case with surgical precision. The tools that emerged were those of a master conservator: bone folders, micro spatulae, fine screwdrivers, and most tellingly, a glass vial of specialized solvent designed for removing archival adhesives without damaging underlying materials. The confrontation. When Poirot touched the lamp switch, soft light bloomed over the room, revealing Lady Victoria frozen at the easel, her conservation kit spread before her like a surgeon's instruments. She did not start or cry out. Instead, a strange dignity settled over her, as if she had been expecting this moment. "Lady Victoria," Poirot said, his voice grave without cruelty, "it is late for conservation work." The evidence was undeniable. 2 screws were half drawn from the frame, a small magnet adhered to the alarm contact, and the specialized tools lay open in their precise arrangement. Her response revealed both professional pride and moral complexity. "I intended to prevent you from making a public spectacle of Professor Hartwell's work," she said evenly. "The police do not handle masterpieces with proper delicacy." But Poirot's analysis cut deeper than mere evidence tampering. The adhesive used when the placard's text was altered is a proprietary formulation from your conservation laboratory. I recognized its distinctive scent on your gloves yesterday evening. This is not merely preservation. It is authorship of deception. The full revelation. Under the gentle but relentless pressure of Poirot's questioning, the full scope of Lady Victoria's involvement emerged. She had not merely authenticated Professor Hartwell's tribute. She had guided its creation, lending her intimate knowledge of Moreau's actual techniques to transform a scholarly homage into a masterpiece capable of deceiving the most sophisticated experts. Professor Hartwell possessed the vision and artistic skill, she admitted, her professional composure finally cracking. But I provided the technical knowledge that made his tribute indistinguishable from Moreau's own hand. The dual pressure patterns Dr. Richter observed were evidence of my guidance during the painting's creation. Her involvement extended far beyond artistic collaboration. Using her position as a respected conservator, she had provided the technical infrastructure necessary for Whitfield's criminal network. Falsified reference materials, corrupted authentication databases, even the specialized equipment required for creating convincing provenance documentation. "The art world is built on fictions," she said, her voice carrying the weight of profound disillusionment. At least this one honored something true, Professor Hartwell's devotion to his mentor's vision. The institutional corruption. As Lady Victoria was led away, Poirot's analysis revealed the conspiracy's most disturbing aspect, the systematic corruption of legitimate cultural institutions from within. Her position had provided access to museum-quality reference collections, conservation laboratories, and authentication databases, allowing the creation of deceptions that could withstand the most rigorous scientific scrutiny. She bridged the respectable and the criminal worlds, Poirot observed with characteristic melancholy. Her reputation ensured unquestioned acceptance of her professional judgments, while her technical expertise made even honest analysis yield predetermined results. The revelation transformed our understanding of Sir Bartholomew's murder. While Whitfield had administered the digitalis, Lady Victoria's role had been far more crucial. She had created the circumstances that made murder seem necessary, orchestrating a deception so sophisticated that exposure would have destroyed not merely individual reputations, but public confidence in the authentication process itself. The final brush stroke. As dawn broke over Grosvenor Square, Poirot stood before Professor Hartwell's masterpiece one final time. The painting's mysterious hand, forever poised in the moment before creation, had inspired a conspiracy that reached into the very foundations of artistic authentication and cultural preservation. "The hand that drew the final line," he murmured, "was indeed motivated by love, Professor Hartwell's tribute to his mentor's vision. But the hands that guided that creation, that transformed tribute into weapon, that drew the final line of Sir Bartholomew's life, those hands belonged to someone whose position at the heart of the art world made their corruption both possible and devastating. The investigation had revealed not merely a murder, but a systematic betrayal of the trust upon which the entire art world depends. Tomorrow's final gathering would complete the picture, exposing the full scope of a conspiracy that had turned the guardians of cultural heritage into instruments of elaborate fraud. The game was approaching its decisive conclusion, and Poirot's methodical brilliance had uncovered the most dangerous criminal of all, one who corrupted not from the margins of society, but from its most trusted institutions. The true hand that drew the final line was about to be revealed, along with the institutional rot that had made such elaborate deception possible. The pale October morning settled over the gallery with an almost crystalline clarity that seemed to strip away the final veils of deception surrounding our investigation. I found Poirot in the main salon at precisely 9 o'clock, positioned before Professor Hartwell's masterpiece with an expression that suggested his little grey cells had finally achieved perfect order in what had been a most complex puzzle. "Hastings," he greeted me with that particular tone of quiet satisfaction that indicated approaching revelation. "Today we witness the completion of a masterpiece, not merely of artistic creation, but of criminal investigation. The hand that drew the final line shall be revealed in all its intricate complexity." The assembly of evidence. Inspector Japp's arrival brought news that the conspiracy's tentacles were unraveling throughout the international art world. Lady Victoria's arrest had triggered examinations of authentication records spanning nearly a decade, revealing a pattern of systematic corruption that extended far beyond a single gallery's walls. "The scope is staggering," Japp reported, his satisfaction evident. "Museums in 3 countries have discovered suspicious provenance documents bearing her authentication. Private collectors are questioning purchases worth millions. But Poirot, you said there was more to reveal." Poirot nodded slowly, his green eyes reflecting that particular intensity that preceded his most significant revelations. "Indeed, Inspector, we have arrested the instrument and the accomplice, but the true architect of this criminal symphony, the hand that guided all other hands, requires final exposition." The final gathering. At Poirot's request, the remaining participants assembled in the gallery's main salon for what he termed the ultimate authentication of truth. Professor Hartwell arrived with dignified resignation, his scholarly integrity having survived the ordeal intact. Miss Reed maintained her professional composure, though her experience had clearly affected her deeply. Dr. Richter brought his scientific equipment, prepared for what Poirot had described as the final demonstration. Lady Victoria, escorted by a constable, entered with that rigid composure that had characterized her throughout our investigation. She took the chair Poirot indicated with apparent calm, though I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her gloves, a detail that would prove more significant than any of us initially realized. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying the authority that commanded absolute attention. "We have solved the immediate crime. Monsieur Whitfield administered the digitalis that ended Sir Bartholomew's life. But the true masterpiece of deception extends far beyond a single, desperate act of murder. The physical evidence speaks." Poirot's analysis began with seemingly trivial details that, when properly illuminated, revealed the conspiracy's true scope. He produced Miss Reed's leather-bound journal, opening it to pages covered with Lady Victoria's angular handwriting. "Observe, mes amis," he announced, indicating faint smudges where the ink had blotted. The drag of the ink across the downstroke, pulled, not pushed. The handwriting of someone who is naturally left-handed, though she has trained herself to write with her right for professional purposes. Dr. Richter nodded confirmation. The microscopic fiber we discovered, the specialized polymer from optical cleaning cloths, shows similar asymmetrical wear patterns consistent with left-handed usage of conservation tools. Poirot moved to the easel where 3 brushes of varying lengths had been arranged. Professor Hartwell, when you created your tribute to Moreau, you worked with your dominant right hand, n'est-ce pas? Always, Hartwell confirmed, his voice carrying quiet dignity. My left has never been suitable for fine work. Yet observe, Poirot continued, producing the brass loop Lady Victoria had been found with on the night of the murder, the positioning of wear marks on this magnification device. The thumb pressure falls on the left side, the grip of someone whose natural inclination is sinistral, though professionally trained to appear otherwise. The collaborative deception. What followed was Poirot's most masterful demonstration. He requested that each person take up a brush as if to make a final stroke on a prepared canvas. Professor Hartwell's right-handed grip was natural and confident. Miss Reed's amateur attempt was clumsy but clearly right-handed. When Lady Victoria's turn came, her left hand moved to the brush with unconscious precision, her posture shifting in ways that revealed decades of training. But now, Poirot announced, producing the longest brush, the conservator's tool for guiding another's hand. Professor, if you would position yourself as if painting... The demonstration that followed was both elegant and demying. As Professor Hartwell raised his right hand in painting position, Lady Victoria's left hand moved instinctively to guide his wrist, the long brush poised to direct pressure and angle. The collaboration was so natural, so practiced, that it could only have been perfected through extensive repetition. Voila, Poirot announced quietly. The dual pressure patterns Dr. Richter detected in the painting's brushwork. Not merely pentimenti, changes during creation, but evidence of constant guidance. Lady Victoria did not simply authenticate Professor Hartwell's tribute, she helped create its deceptive perfection. The institutional corruption. Revealed, under Poirot's relentless analysis, the full scope of Lady Victoria's criminal enterprise emerged with devastating clarity. Her position as a respected conservator had provided not merely access to technical expertise, but to the very foundations of art world authentication. Consider the sophistication required, Poirot explained, his voice carrying profound gravity. The fictional Swiss collection required manipulation of international legal databases, creation of false telephone services, even corruption of legitimate law firms. Such operations demand not criminal cunning alone, but institutional authority. Someone whose reputation ensures unquestioned acceptance of their professional judgments. The evidence was overwhelming. Ladies, Victoria had used her museum connections to create false provenance documents, her conservation laboratory to produce specialized materials for deception, and her international network to establish the elaborate fiction that had deceived even Miss Reed's meticulous verification process. The adhesive used in altering the title placard, Poirot revealed, is a proprietary formulation from your conservation laboratory. The specialized equipment required for creating convincing documentation, all resources available only to someone at the highest levels of museum infrastructure. The psychological masterpiece. Most damning was Poirot's revelation of how Lady Victoria had orchestrated the human elements of the conspiracy. She had not merely recruited participants, but had carefully cultivated their weaknesses and dependencies to ensure their compliance. Professor Hartwell's financial desperation made him vulnerable to exploitation of his artistic devotion. Monsieur Whitfield's mounting debts made him desperate for any opportunity, regardless of legality. Sir Bartholomew's vanity made him eager to believe in discoveries that would enhance his reputation. Each was manipulated with surgical precision. When Sir Bartholomew had begun to harbor genuine doubts and arranged for Dr. Richter's independent assessment, Lady Victoria had recognized the threat to her carefully constructed enterprise. Her response had been to manipulate Whitfield's desperation into murderous action. "You did not administer the digitalis yourself," Poirot addressed Lady Victoria directly, "but you created the circumstances that made murder seem inevitable to a desperate man. You provided the technical knowledge that made the poison undetectable, the timing that made discovery unlikely, and the psychological pressure that drove Monsieur Whitfield to act. The final confrontation. Lady Victoria's response revealed both the scope of her criminal sophistication and her complete lack of moral remorse. When she finally spoke, her voice carried not shame, but intellectual pride in her achievement. "The art world is built on fictions," she declared, her grey eyes holding that cold calculation I had noticed from our first meeting. "Provenance, authenticity, even artistic value, all are constructs maintained by institutions that profit from public ignorance. I merely created more elegant fictions than most." Her justification was as chilling as it was comprehensive. She had not seen herself as a criminal, but as someone who had perfected the art world's existing deceptions. Professor Hartwell's tribute had been transformed into a weapon not through corruption of art, but through corruption of the systems designed to authenticate and preserve it. "You manipulated a scholar's devotion," Poirot replied, his voice carrying profound sadness. "Exploited a dealer's desperation and orchestrated a man's murder, all to protect a network of systematic fraud that perverted the very cultural preservation you were trusted to uphold." Justice and reflection. As Lady Victoria was led away, her dignity intact but her moral bankruptcy fully exposed, Poirot remained before Professor Hartwell's masterpiece one final time. The painting's mysterious hand, forever poised in the moment before creation, had inspired a conspiracy that revealed the deepest vulnerabilities in systems designed to preserve human artistic achievement. "The hand that drew the final line," he observed with characteristic melancholy, "belonged to someone we trusted to preserve artistic integrity. The greatest crimes, Hastings, are committed not by those who reject society's values, but by those entrusted to uphold them." The investigation had exposed not merely a murder, but a systematic betrayal of public trust that extended throughout the international art world. Lady Victoria's corruption had been devastating precisely because it came from within the institutions society trusted to preserve truth and beauty. As we prepared to leave the gallery, the painting continued to preside over the scene with serene indifference to the human dramas it had inspired. Professor Hartwell's honest tribute to his mentor had survived the conspiracy that had sought to exploit it, but the revelation of institutional corruption would forever change how the art world viewed its own authentication processes. The masterpiece of murder had been solved, revealing truths about human nature and institutional vulnerability that were as complex and disturbing as any great work of art, and considerably more troubling. The final line had indeed been drawn, completing a picture of corruption that began with the noblest of artistic impulses and ended with the basest of criminal enterprises. The hand that drew the final line had been exposed, along with the systematic corruption that had made such elaborate deception possible. Justice had been served, but at the cost of illusions about the integrity of institutions we had trusted without question. The pale November morning settled over the gallery with that crystalline quality of light that seems to strip away all pretense, leaving only truth in its most unforgiving clarity. I found Poirot positioned before Professor Hartwell's masterpiece at precisely 10 o'clock, his green eyes reflecting the profound satisfaction that comes only when the final piece of a complex puzzle slides into its inevitable place. "Hastings," he greeted me with quiet authority, "today we complete not merely an investigation, but a masterpiece of revelation. The hand that drew the final line shall be exposed in all its terrible artistry." The final gathering. Inspector Japp's arrival brought the formal weight of justice to our proceedings. The remaining participants assembled with the gravity of those who understood they were witnessing not merely the conclusion of a murder investigation, but the exposure of systematic corruption that had infected the very heart of cultural preservation. Professor Hartwell entered with dignified resignation, his scholarly integrity having survived the ordeal intact. Miss Reed maintained her professional composure, though her experience had clearly marked her deeply. Dr. Richter brought his scientific equipment, prepared for what Poirot had described as the ultimate authentication of truth. Lady Victoria, escorted by a constable, took her place with that rigid composure that had characterized her throughout our investigation. Only the slight tremor in her gloved hands betrayed the enormous pressure beneath her carefully maintained facade. Poirot's methodical revelation. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular authority that commanded absolute attention, "we have traveled through a labyrinth of artistic deception and human frailty. We have seen a masterpiece created from love, perverted by institutional corruption and culminating in calculated murder. Now the final brushstrokes of truth must be applied." He gestured toward the painting, now starkly illuminated by morning light. Professor Hartwell created Hommage à mon maître as tribute to his beloved mentor. But the hand that guided its creation, that ensured its deceptive perfection, that transformed honest homage into criminal weapon, that hand belonged to Lady Victoria Pemberton. His analysis proceeded with characteristic precision, revealing layer upon layer of sophisticated deception. Observe the evidence that spoke to the little gray cells. The velvet drape cord, coiled against natural habit, the work of a left-handed person trained to precision. The title placard, altered with museum-quality equipment using specialized adhesives available only to senior conservation professionals. The dual pressure patterns in the brushwork itself, evidence not of artistic revision, but of constant guidance. Poirot demonstrated with devastating effectiveness how Lady Victoria's left-handed dominance, carefully concealed throughout her professional career, had left traces throughout the crime scene. The brass loop with MW initials, not Monsieur Whitfield's tool, but evidence of your examination of his work. The asymmetrical wear patterns on conservation instruments. Even the drag of ink in Miss Reed's journal, where you made entries with your trained but unnatural right hand. The institutional conspiracy. Exposed. But this extends far beyond a single forgery, Poirot continued, his voice gaining intensity. Lady Victoria, you created a criminal enterprise of breathtaking sophistication, using your position at the heart of the art world to corrupt the very systems designed to prevent fraud. The full scope of her conspiracy emerged under his relentless analysis. The fictional Swiss collection, supported by manipulated international databases, the corruption of legitimate law firms, the systematic falsification of authentication records spanning nearly a decade. Her network had generated fraudulent transactions worth tens of millions of pounds, all bearing her unassailable professional seal of approval. You cultivated Professor Hartwell's financial desperation, exploiting his artistic devotion. You manipulated Monsieur Whitfield's mounting debts, transforming him into your instrument of murder. You perverted Sir Bartholomew's scholarly vanity, making him eager to believe in discoveries that would enhance his reputation. Each was positioned with surgical precision in your criminal symphony. The psychological masterstroke. Poirot's revelation of the murder's orchestration was particularly chilling in its calculated precision. When Sir Bartholomew arranged for Dr. Richter's independent assessment, you recognized the threat to your carefully constructed enterprise. Your response was not desperate improvisation, but methodical manipulation of Monsieur Whitfield's panic into murderous action. The digitalis had been prepared using specialized knowledge of dosage and timing, administered through Sir Bartholomew's distinctive wineglass with its carefully positioned chip. Even the murder had been designed to maintain the conspiracy's elegant facade of respectability. You provided the technical knowledge that made the poison undetectable, the psychological pressure that drove Whitfield to act, and the institutional authority that would have protected you from suspicion. The hand that drew the final line of Sir Bartholomew's life was guided by intelligence far more sophisticated than mere criminal opportunism. The final confrontation. Lady Victoria's response revealed both the scope of her criminal sophistication and her complete lack of moral remorse. When she finally spoke, her voice carried not shame, but intellectual pride in her achievement. "A masterful deduction, Monsieur Poirot," she said with cold admiration. "You have indeed painted a complete picture. One might almost call it artistic in its precision." Her justification was as chilling as it was comprehensive. She had not seen herself as criminal, but as someone who had perfected the art world's existing deceptions, creating more elegant fictions than the crude corruptions she claimed to despise. "The art world is built on fictions," she declared, her grey eyes holding that calculation I had noticed from our first meeting. "Provenance, authenticity, even artistic value, all are constructs maintained by institutions that profit from public ignorance. I merely created superior constructs." Inspector Japp stepped forward with grim satisfaction. "Lady Victoria Pemberton, I'm arresting you for the murder of Sir Bartholomew Ashford and for conspiracy to defraud. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. The aftermath of justice." In the days that followed, the conspiracy's international ramifications continued to unfold, with devastating consequences for the legitimate art world. Museums announced comprehensive audits, collectors questioned purchases worth millions, and the entire authentication process faced fundamental restructuring. Miss Reed accepted the melancholy task of disentangling Sir Bartholomew's legacy from the threads of deception woven through it. "He wanted so much to believe in his discoveries," she reflected with quiet dignity. "I suppose we all do." Professor Hartwell's vindication was complete, but perhaps most moving was his final gesture. In a simple ceremony attended only by our small group, he took up pen and paper to write on the verso of his masterpiece's stretcher, "Hommage à mon maître, conçu par Lucien Moreau, exécuté par Edmund Hartwell. Pour l'amour de l'art, et non pour sa corruption." "The line has been drawn at last," he said quietly. "Not in pigment, but in truth where deception cannot touch it." Poirot's final reflection. As we prepared to leave the gallery for the final time, Poirot paused before the painting that had precipitated such dramatic revelations. His expression combined satisfaction at justice achieved with profound sadness at the corruption of institutions society had trusted without question. "The hand that drew the final line," he observed with characteristic precision, "was indeed motivated by love, Professor Hartwell's tribute to his mentor's vision. But the hands that transformed that tribute into weapon, that drew the final line of Sir Bartholomew's life, that corrupted the very guardians of cultural truth, those hands belonged to someone whose position at the heart of the art world made their betrayal both possible and devastating." He straightened his tie with characteristic precision, his green eyes reflecting that particular melancholy that follows the solution of cases involving the corruption of trust. "The greatest crimes, mon ami, are committed not by those who reject society's values, but by those entrusted to preserve them. Lady Victoria's corruption was devastating precisely because it came from within the institutions we trusted without question." As we walked into the November morning, the gallery behind us seemed to exhale collectively, releasing tensions held too long. The painting remained, its creator vindicated, its beauty intact despite the human dramas it had inspired. "Art reveals truth through beauty, Hastings," Poirot observed as we reached the street. "But sometimes the truth it reveals is far uglier than the beauty that conceals it. The hand that drew the final line has been exposed, and with it, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those we trust most completely." The case was closed, but its lessons would endure, a testament to the power of methodical investigation and unwavering moral purpose, and a warning that corruption can flourish even in the most hallowed institutions when trust replaces vigilance. The masterpiece of murder had been solved, revealing truths about human nature and institutional vulnerability that were as complex and disturbing as any great work of art. Justice had been served, but at the cost of illusions about the integrity of the systems we had trusted without question. The final line had indeed been drawn, completing a picture of corruption and redemption that would stand as one of Poirot's most challenging and significant investigations. A reminder that the little grey cells must remain forever vigilant against those who would corrupt the very foundations of civilized society. The pale December morning settled over London with that crystalline quality of winter light that seems to strip away all pretense, leaving only truth in its most unforgiving clarity. I found Poirot in his sitting room at Whitehaven Mansions, the morning papers arranged before him with characteristic precision, though his attention seemed focused not on current events, but on deeper reflections about human nature and institutional vulnerability. "Ah, Hastings," he greeted me with familiar warmth, though his green eyes held that particular melancholy that followed cases involving the corruption of trust. "How fitting that you should arrive as I contemplate the final chapter of our most complex investigation. The newspapers speak much of trials and verdicts, but they understand so little of the true masterpiece we witnessed, the systematic corruption of the very institutions society trusts to preserve cultural truth." The weight of justice. The proceedings at the Old Bailey had concluded just 1 week prior with verdicts that satisfied legal requirements while revealing the staggering scope of the conspiracy we had unraveled. Lady Victoria Pemberton received life imprisonment for Sir Bartholomew's murder, with additional sentences for fraud totaling 35 years, terms that would ensure she never again corrupted the institutions she had been trusted to protect. The judge's remarks, Poirot observed, stirring his tisane with methodical precision, were particularly severe regarding institutional betrayal. "When guardians of cultural heritage become instruments of deception," his lordship said, "the damage extends far beyond financial loss to strike at civilization's very foundations." Marcus Whitfield, whose confession had proved both comprehensive and genuinely remorseful, received 20 years with consideration for his cooperation in exposing the international network. His testimony had led to arrests across 3 countries and the recovery of fraudulent artworks worth over £50 million. He was the instrument, Poirot reflected, but not the composer of this criminal symphony. His cooperation has earned judicial mercy, though the music he helped create will echo through the art world for years to come. The vindication of integrity. Perhaps most satisfying was Professor Edmund Hartwell's complete vindication. The elderly scholar had emerged from the ordeal with his reputation not merely intact, but enhanced by the dignity with which he had faced both accusation and exploitation. His masterpiece, Hommage à mon maître, had found its proper home at the Tate Gallery, acquired not as a Moreau original, but as Professor Hartwell's tribute, a work of art in its own right. The acquisition, Poirot noted with evident satisfaction, was accompanied by a comprehensive exhibition documenting the painting's complex journey from scholarly homage through criminal exploitation to final recognition as legitimate artistic achievement. Professor Hartwell donated the proceeds to establish the Hartwell Foundation, supporting elderly scholars facing financial hardship. The Foundation's creation had transformed personal tragedy into institutional reform, ensuring that no scholar would again face the desperate choice between integrity and survival that had made Professor Hartwell vulnerable to exploitation. Miss Reed's transformation. Constance Reed's evolution from unwitting accomplice to institutional reformer represented perhaps the investigation's most hopeful outcome. Her meticulous nature, once exploited by criminals, now served the cause of preventing future deceptions. She had accepted the position of Director of Authentication Standards at the newly established International Art Verification Institute. Her experience with systematic deception, Poirot observed, has qualified her uniquely to design systems for its prevention. She understands both the technical methods criminals employ and the psychological vulnerabilities they exploit. The art world could not ask for a more qualified guardian against future corruption. The systematic reforms. The conspiracy's exposure had triggered comprehensive reforms throughout the international art world that addressed both technical procedures and human vulnerabilities. Authentication now required multiple independent verifications from institutions with no financial interest in the outcome. Provenance documentation faced enhanced scrutiny through international databases that cross-referenced ownership claims against theft reports and suspicious transactions. Conservation laboratories implemented security measures designed to prevent the sort of institutional corruption Lady Victoria had perfected. Specialized materials were tracked through chain-of-custody procedures, and access to authentication equipment required multiple authorizations. Most significantly, financial support systems for scholars eliminated the desperation that criminals had exploited so effectively. The reforms extend beyond technical procedures. Poirot explained, his voice carrying profound gravity, to address the psychological isolation that expertise creates. Peer review processes now ensure that no single expert, however distinguished, can authenticate high-value works without independent confirmation. The deeper implications. As we sat in the comfortable warmth of his morning routine, Poirot's reflections turned to the broader lessons our investigation had revealed about modern society's vulnerabilities. His analysis was characteristically precise, but touched with genuine concern for the institutions that preserve civilization's achievements. The case of the hand that drew the final line, he observed thoughtfully, demonstrated something most disturbing about institutional authority. We have created systems of such complexity and specialization that their guardians operate beyond public understanding or effective oversight. When such guardians become corrupt, the damage extends far beyond immediate victims to threaten the very foundations of cultural preservation. Lady Victoria's position had provided not merely opportunity for crime, but immunity from suspicion. Her reputation had served as both weapon and shield, allowing her to corrupt systems from within while maintaining the appearance of professional integrity. Consider, mon ami, how her criminal enterprise succeeded precisely because it operated within legitimate structures. The fictional Swiss collection was believable because it used real legal procedures and professional documentation. The authentication fraud succeeded because it corrupted genuine expertise rather than replacing it with obvious forgery. The personal cost of truth. Despite the satisfaction of justice achieved, Poirot's reflections carried undertones of melancholy that spoke to the personal cost of confronting such systematic corruption. The case had revealed not merely individual criminality, but institutional vulnerabilities that threatened the very foundations of cultural preservation. We saved Professor Hartwell's reputation and exposed Lady Victoria's crimes, he said quietly, his moustaches twitching with suppressed emotion. But we could not restore Sir Bartholomew's life or repair the damage to public trust in authentication systems. Some victories, Hastings, are achieved at prices that make celebration impossible. The investigation had also revealed the dangerous isolation that expertise can create. Each of our suspects had possessed specialized knowledge that separated them from ordinary understanding, creating both opportunity for crime and barriers to detection. The artistic legacy. Perhaps most poignantly, our investigation had demonstrated both the vulnerability and resilience of artistic truth. Professor Hartwell's masterpiece had survived its exploitation by criminals, emerging with its essential integrity intact despite the human dramas surrounding it. Art endures, Poirot observed, his gaze resting on a reproduction of the painting that now graced his sitting-room wall, while the corruption that seeks to exploit it ultimately destroys itself. Lady Victoria's criminal sophistication could not survive the simple application of methodical investigation and moral clarity. The painting's mysterious hand, forever poised in the moment before creation, had inspired both the noblest artistic devotion and the basest criminal exploitation. Yet it emerged from our investigation as testimony to the power of genuine artistic achievement to transcend the human weaknesses that surround it. The methodical triumph. As our conversation approached its natural conclusion, Poirot's satisfaction with the case's resolution became more evident. His methodical approach had succeeded where conventional investigation might have failed, revealing connections too subtle for ordinary detection. "The little grey cells succeeded," he said with characteristic precision, "because they refused to accept surface explanations. Lady Victoria's position provided perfect camouflage for criminal activity, but methodology does not respect reputation or social standing. Truth emerges when proper questions are asked with sufficient persistence." He rose and moved to the window, adjusting the blinds with that obsessive attention to symmetry that marked all his actions. "Observe, Hastings, how morning light reveals what evening shadows concealed. The velvet cord coiled against natural habit, the unconscious signature of left-handed precision. The clove oil scent, with its whisper of orris, betraying the conservator's specialized toolkit. The chair pressed deeper into carpet, evidence of someone who waited with professional patience for the precise moment of deception. The final reflection. As I prepared to leave Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot offered one final observation that seemed to encapsulate both the case's significance and its enduring lessons about human nature and institutional responsibility. "The hand that drew the final line, mon ami, belonged ultimately not to any individual criminal, but to justice itself." Professor Hartwell's tribute to his mentor survived corruption. Lady Victoria's crimes faced exposure, and the institutions she betrayed emerged stronger through necessary reform. He straightened his tie with characteristic precision, his green eyes reflecting that particular satisfaction that comes from order restored and truth revealed. "We cannot prevent all corruption, Hastings. But we can ensure that when it occurs, it faces the methodical application of moral clarity and intellectual precision. The greatest crimes are committed not by those who reject society's values, but by those entrusted to preserve them." The masterpiece of murder had been solved, its lessons absorbed, and its legacy secured through institutional reform. The conspiracy had revealed the dangerous isolation that expertise creates and the systematic vulnerability of institutions that operate beyond public understanding. Yet it had also demonstrated the power of methodical investigation to penetrate even the most sophisticated deceptions. As I walked through the December morning toward my own flat, the case's resolution seemed to settle around me like the satisfaction that follows the completion of any great work of art. The investigation had exposed not merely a murder, but a systematic betrayal of public trust that extended throughout the international art world. Yet from that exposure had come reforms that would protect future generations from similar exploitation. The hand that drew the final line had indeed been revealed, not as instrument of corruption, but as agent of justice, guided by the methodical brilliance that made Hercule Poirot the greatest detective of our age. The little grey cells had once again proven their superiority over even the most sophisticated criminal deception, completing a masterpiece of investigation that would stand among his greatest achievements. In the end, the true artistry lay not in the painting that had precipitated such dramatic revelations, but in the methodical process by which truth had been separated from deception, justice from corruption, and genuine artistic devotion from its criminal exploitation. The final line had been drawn with precision and moral authority, completing a picture of human nature that was as complex and disturbing as any great work of art, and considerably more necessary for the preservation of civilized society.